it's impossible to miss some of the virtues of Ashes and Diamonds. It looks really cool. It has vibes. It has memorable characters. Did I mention it looks really cool? You might as well go watch this movie right now. You don't need me to tell you about these things. But there are some aspects of the movie that maybe time has covered over a little bit. So let's dust those off and see if we can come up with something insightful to say about this cool movie. Ashes and Diamonds came out in 1958, but it's set in 1945, which was a big year for Poland. It was directed by Andrzej Wajda, one of the guys who really got the ball rolling for art film and maybe film in general in Poland. Let me give you one piece of Andrzej Wajda trivia that you'll only get on this channel, maybe. Before he directed films, Wajda directed a few plays, and one thing he put on was A Hatful of Rain, which is a play written by Michael V. Gazzo, who is a playwright that had a few acting roles as well, including being nominated for an Academy Award for acting for being in The Godfather. That play, A Hatful of Rain, was also turned into a movie called A Hatful of Rain, directed by my hero, Fred Zinnemann. That was in 1957. Maybe is this a completely useless tangent? Partly, but I actually think that this Hatful of Rain movie shares a few things with Ashes and Diamonds. That's a downcast, gloomy, overcast film about drug addiction, and it's kind of similar to some of the themes in this movie. Zbigniew Cybulski has an iconic role in Ashes and Diamonds as Maciek, a guy who wears his sunglasses at night and who also happens to be in the underground. The underground, but wasn't World War II over? Well, yes, but Poland is now, when I say now, I mean then, contending with the beginning of Soviet life, which would continue until long after this movie came out. The film was based on a book which most people would say favored the Communist Party. It was required reading in schools at one point, in fact, supposedly, but Andrzej Wajda made some adjustments to the book. They don't entirely reverse the moral force of the story. These adjustments didn't entirely satisfy his critics then or now, but they do create an interesting balance. They create a stirring impression. I think you could probably count Ashes and Diamonds among a broad category of Soviet films that just about snuck under the noses of government censors. Movies that the government maybe would not want to be released in hindsight. Something like The Fireman's Ball comes to mind. That's a Czech film. I'm going to Czechia in a few weeks, believe it or not. That movie is much more of a satire than this movie, and more comedic in general. Although Ashes and Diamonds is actually pretty funny. It's funny in an unexpected way. The point, really, though, the reason I bring up these other films, The Fireman's Ball and such, is that there's often some ingenuity in the space between these films and the mainstream doctrine. There's something going on there, some ideas being bounced off the mainstream ideas. And sometimes, as years go by, that can be a little bit lost. Sometimes you read about these films as being super edgy, and then you watch them and you think, that seemed like it was just some guys going to a party. I like The Fireman's Ball, by the way, but you probably know what I'm talking about. Ashes and Diamonds, in some ways, is a pretty timeless movie just because it looks so cool. But there's maybe a little bit of context that you could use. Ashes and Diamonds, by the way, also features a fancy dinner. It's not quite as central to the plot as the one in The Fireman's Ball, but this is an interesting motif, the dinner party of communist bureaucrats. Sometimes this luxury would have contrasted sharply with the hunger of people not at the party. Like I said, I wouldn't really describe Ashes and Diamonds as a satire. There are some pieces of satire, I think, like the conducting of the band at the very end. There's also a band in The Fireman's Ball, by the way. Interesting how things like food and music play into these somewhat rigid societies. The first word that comes to my mind, though, it's not satire. It's ennui, moral listlessness. During World War II, you can imagine a lot of people were galvanized. At least that's what you would think. That's what history would lead you to believe. Probably most people wanted to get the invaders out of their country. But after the war, maybe things are different, and it's not quite as obvious what should happen. Maybe you have a huge opportunity to reshape a country. Who has this opportunity? Well, I don't know, but somebody, in theory, does. But what's going to happen? What are you going to do? I'm not a historian, but in this movie, nobody quite seems to be doing the right thing. I think the moral balance of Ashes and Diamonds is key. The movie opens with Maciek and his associate, his friend, sort of, lounging on the grass by a church. It's a lovely day, and they're sitting out in the sun, and a young girl comes up to them and asks for help laying flowers out at the chapel nearby. Wow, this is idyllic stuff, right? But a couple of moments later, they're going to open fire on a car that comes by carrying a bureaucrat of unclear significance. They're trying to assassinate. And turns out they shoot the wrong person and have to spend the rest of the movie trying to make things right. This is a pretty elegant narrative device, but it's also quite a switcheroo from the idyllic opening. This plot device also leaves a lot of room for Maciek to think about what he's doing when he has to do a second take on carrying out his task. Maybe it gives him some more time to think. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a review of this movie that does not use the term Polish James Dean in reference to Zbigniew Cybulski. You won't hear me say that, of course. Although Cybulski would go on to die relatively young, not in a car crash, but while boarding a train. I guess that's Poland for you. Obviously, Maciek is the linchpin of the movie in many ways, and it's an interesting character that, again, helps create a moral balance. He mainly seems interested in looking cool, at least at first. He wants to talk to girls. He's sort of tough, but he's also a bit of a lackey. That said, there is something inside of him. There is an intuition there. He is thinking about something, it would seem. One of the interesting things about this movie as a whole is that on the surface, it's all very stylized. But if you look one layer beneath the surface, there's still a lot of style down there. But if you go down one more layer, this is a poignant movie. It might sneak up on you, but this is a moving film. Maciek doesn't do a 180. There's not some big contrived changing of his mind or something that happens. Or there's there is. I'm not going to spoil it. But he does show another side to him, something that maybe you wouldn't quite expect from the beginning. There's some sort of obvious hints, like there's a moment where he quotes a poem from memory, and you think, well, wait a second, how does this cold-blooded killer know about poems, right? I didn't know he could read. But there's also some more subtle stuff going on, just a thoughtfulness perhaps behind the eyes here and there. He has an interesting relationship with the concierge at the hotel. They're both from Warsaw. There is some connection there. They both seem like expatriates in their own country, but the concierge is a bit older, and Maciek is impatient. He has this thing he has to do, and they don't really connect. They sort of do. Of course, he has an interesting relationship with a woman he meets at the bar. This is kind of a central thing in the film, and maybe he's just trying to pick her up, or maybe he really needs someone to talk to. It's a little simplistic how the film positions this woman as the emblem of balanced life, or possibly as a glimmer of hope for a new nation, but we do see how these conditions in 1945, a time you might expect to be somewhat triumphant, well, these conditions have actually undermined just about every relationship that Maciek might reach for. It's a society operating kind of in the wrong way. Of course, there are some people having fun, or trying to. They're hosting dinners, they're listening to music, they're conducting the band, they're dancing, but they tend to stop a little short, to get caught thinking about something else or looking backward. The society is not total chaos. There are some mechanisms. There is some order. For instance, some people are trying to climb the bureaucratic ladder by all means necessary, or preserve a certain type of social respectability or standing. But it kind of feels like the race has already been run, and are those really the pursuits that people should be undertaking? It's not clear. On the verge of this new nation, in a time that should be triumphant, people seem lost. It's possible that all these lost people and the occasional pure soul among them are the ashes and the diamonds, although the poem that Maciek reads out perhaps gives a pretty strong hint as to what Wida was thinking about with ashes and diamonds. The poem is called Ashes and Diamonds, written by Cyprian Norwood, and it's kind of shoved in the audience's face. Makes me not want to think about it too much, but there's a few interesting things here. I'm not going to quote too directly because the poem is in Polish, but it talks about a burning torch where the flames could be a good thing, a beacon of freedom. Think about the energy of the torch beaming off into the world, or it could be a bad thing. You just burnt your house down. To burn, the torch must reduce itself. Either way, it's this consuming, energetic, and also deathly thing. You can see how this might resonate with people who went through a war, with people who've just triumphed, I guess, in a war in theory, if that's such a thing. Here's the interesting thing. I looked at 3 different translations of this poem. They're all pretty different, but they all talk about you. They all associate this torch with you, with an individual. They all start sort of addressed to you, as if a person is the one who is on fire. And maybe this gives us another angle on Maciek. There's something personal here, and also presumably something national here, and maybe it's no surprise that they go hand in hand. The second half of the poem is about the aftermath. Once the torch is gone, Will there only be ashes left, or might there also be a star-like diamond, something hopeful? Well, this movie is not that hopeful. This movie seems to feature a lot more ash than diamonds, a lot more ashes than diamonds. If there is a glimmer of hope, it seems like just a glimmer. You'll have to watch the movie to find out what is left of Maciek after he immolates. So is this movie on the side of the resistance or on the side of the party? Is it making some big, bold, subversive claim? I took something different from it, more of a story about the listlessness that people are feeling, the moral fatigue or something like that, and how society functions or doesn't function under those conditions, and how that might be extrapolated to an entire nation that's going to, follow from this. I guess it's telling that a movie set in 1945, where people might be celebrating the end of the war, where it might be so triumphant, it has a totally different tone, right? And this movie, is it in a strange way sort of forward-looking because it was made in 1958? People talk a lot about science fiction films maybe being backwards-looking often. Historical films are often nostalgic, but in this one, it seems like it's almost a morality play focused on what happened 15 years later or whatever. So maybe just the tone is as strong of a political statement as you could possibly hope for. At the end of the film, morning comes, and a concierge puts out the Polish flag. There's a lot more to the ending than this, but to me, that's the zenith of the film, and this flag, and the concierge's humble duty to put it out, kind of embodies all the conflict and contradictions that swirl in this new nation. It's not really new, but in this nation facing a mourning of sorts. So that's Ashes and Diamonds, and like I said, it snuck up on me how moving this film is. You're most likely going to notice it for the style, for some of the characters, for some of the kind of cool symbolism, maybe it takes a little while for you to get inside Maciek's head, for him not to just seem like this guy is too cool for school, but I think it's surprisingly poignant by the end, and surprisingly personal, also surprisingly funny. So overall, great movie, Ashes and Diamonds.